Hey, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you are at. We're just going to begin in half a minute. Thank you all for joining. Okay, my name's Arjun Kapoor. I'm a co-director at the Center for Mental Health, Law and Policy, Indian Law Society. It is my privilege and honor to welcome all of you to the first in the series of the Outlive Youth Action for Suicide Prevention, or the YASP Fellowship Dialogues. Um, some of you might be aware, suicides are a huge public health concern, both in India and across the world. Um, by statistics, suicide is the leading cause of death for young people. It's the third leading cause of death for young people across the world. But closer home, back in India, for some of us who are based in India, if you look at the numbers, you find that suicide is the first leading cause of death for young people between the ages of 15 to 29. And given the number of young people we have in India's context, which is probably the largest youth population, that converts to a huge number of suicide deaths across the world. Um, Suicide is a complex issue. There is no one factor that contributes or that can protect suicide or prevent suicide, sorry. There are multiple factors at play at an individual level, at an interpersonal level, at a community level, or at a systemic policy and governance level. In fact, the World Health Organization recommends all countries to develop intersectoral suicide prevention strategies and policies across different areas of governance, whether it be education, health, law enforcement, employment, agriculture, rural development, and self-governance. Um, Historically, we know that not just in India, but across the world, policy processes tend to be exclusionary. It's very difficult for ordinary citizens or young people, for that matter, to participate in policy processes because largely these are led by experts, or just the nature or the discourse or the language around policy tends to be very technical, very jargonistic. Governance systems, policy systems, bureaucratic systems seem like far removed from our everyday lives, even though they impact our lives on a daily basis. So it's all the more important for us to think about how can we engage ordinary citizens, people with lived experience, and more specifically, young people in policy processes. How can young people lead policy change? How can they bring in their own lived experience and the lived experience of their own communities to shape how policies are framed, conceptualized, implemented, evaluated? Because at the end of the day, these are policies which impact our individual lives. And if our voices aren't heard in these spaces, then it's very likely that these policies will not address the realities of our lives. So, in this context, Outlive, which is a youth suicide prevention program that the Center for Mental Health Law and Policy leads, uh, engages young people between the ages of 18 to 25, youth who are typically going to college settings or have just transitioned out of schools into adulthood, and finds ways of strengthening their capacities, of engaging them in different ways to address suicide prevention. And the YASP Fellowship, or the Youth Action for Suicide Prevention Fellowship, is one such initiative which trains and mentors youth leaders in community spaces to actually lead policy engagement, to identify policy solutions in their communities, to address issues that actually impact youth mental health and well-being. So, in many ways, this event is not about the YASP Fellowship. The YASP dialogues are a space for us to convene important stakeholders, of course, young people themselves, but also policymakers, researchers, academics, civil society organizations, to think of what are the ways in which we can build an infrastructure and ecosystem that can support young people, not just in India, but across the world, to understand youth suicide prevention as a policy issue and to find ways of engaging with policymakers and leading policy change on the ground and not just from the top up. So today's event, I'm super excited about this event. We've curated this in two parts. In the first part, we're going to have a conversation with two youth leaders who have engaged with policymakers on the issue of youth suicide prevention. And in the second part, we will open up a panel discussion with sectoral experts across policy, academia, research, and youth mental health to understand some of the pathways that we can construct together to address and support young people in policy engagement. The insights of this particular dialogue will be converted into a policy brief, which we will then share with all of the participants and disseminate for your benefit. So without further ado, I'm extremely excited to invite our first two speakers for today. I'd like to first invite Muneza Shakil and introduce Muneza. Muneza is a Kashmiri urban researcher and a multimedia storyteller working at the intersections of gender, mental health, and urban life. Muneza has been trained as an architect at Jamia Millia Islamia in New Delhi, and is a graduate of the Urban Fellows Program at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. Her work combines research, writing, and visual storytelling to explore how social and spatial inequalities shape everyday experiences. Muneza's work also includes mental health and disability rights advocacy through digital campaigns, community-based research, and feminist initiatives. She has collaborated with organizations such as Change.org, the Unsam Project, Outlive, and the UN Women's Feminist Youth Leadership Program. It is also my pleasure to introduce to you Manas Joshi, who currently works as a school counselor at the Akanksha Foundation in Pune, India, supporting the social and emotional well-being of students. His work involves addressing sensitive issues such as domestic violence, child sexual abuse, substance use, suicidal ideation, and self-harm, while creating safe spaces for students. He also supports the school's well-being structures, including social emotional learning, personal safety education, and circle time. Interestingly, Manas recently facilitated a grade 8 project in which students created a self-published book titled Not Just Pink and Blue, which is aimed at challenging gender stereotypes. Manas and Muneza also have the distinction of being part of the founding cohort of the YASP Fellowship as YASP Fellows. So it is an extreme honor and pleasure to have both of them in conversation. So Muneza, if I can begin with you, you've been particularly focused and concerned about the issue around addressing well-being of marginalized youth and women, young women specifically, in higher educational settings. And this is something that you had picked up during your policy engagement journey. Would you like to talk a little bit about why you identified this issue and what were the links that you saw between this issue, youth suicides, and policy and governance?
Okay, thank you for the introduction. I'm glad to be here. Uh, I would really like to start by saying that the reason why I started this fellowship and the kind of work that I did was a mix of both personal experience, but also it was something that I noticed broadly among youth, among young people in colleges and universities as well. For me, in my own experience as a student, what stayed with me and what pushed me to work towards suicide prevention was not just the distress of it all, but also how institutions like colleges or universities respond to it, or rather fail to respond to it. I would like to give a simple example from when I was going through distress and I sought help from my institution. I talked to a coordinator and I asked him if it is a safe space, and he asked me, "What is a safe space?" Um, and I wanted to report um a very emotionally uh, difficult interaction with another teacher, and I shared it with him, and the very next day, that teacher got to know about it, and she called me up and she extremely humiliated me. And that was the time when, for the first time, I ever, reached out to us suicide helpline. But that was also the time when I called my friend who was studying law, and I was like, can nothing be done about this? Is this something that should happen? Do I have no other way to like report it or address it? So I think that was when something shifted in me. Uh, but I also began to realize that this incident was not isolated. During the fellowship, when I started engaging with other young people, I kept hearing similar patterns where the environment that is supposed to support you can actually intensify your vulnerability. So during the fellowship, that was the reason why during the fellowship I focused particularly on teachers training program. um, I wanted to understand what kind of training teachers are receiving or are supposed to receive when it comes to their students, when it comes to mental health, and ultimately when it comes to suicide prevention as well. What I found out was when, while mental health is mentioned, the approach was largely generic. So I realized that uh, there wasn't appropriate structured training on how to identify suicide risk, how to respond safely, or how to even provide basic emotional first aid. But apart from that, what I also realized that it assumed a kind of uniform student experience, which is not the reality. The second part of my advocacy was also focused the on the fact that students come with layered identities, caste, class, religion, disability, economic background, etc. They all shape how distress is experienced. For marginalized students, especially, the institutional environment can become additional site of pressure. Um, so for me, I understood that educational environment becomes a really, really key determinant of mental health and suicide risk. And for that, teachers are often the first point of contact. They can act as a support system, but if there is no right training, they can also unintentionally uh, reinforce harm. So that is where it becomes not an individual issue of teachers failing, but it becomes a policy issue. It's about systems not equipping them also. If there are no standardized protocols that were followed, no accountability structures, or no requirement for teachers to be trained in responding to distress, then these incidents would keep on happening even after I graduate. So based on this, I developed and submitted my recommendation to UGC. Like after a year of research and all, the key changes that I recommended was first, suicide structured suicide prevention should or and gatekeepers training should be systemically integrated into teachers education, so that there is a system that recognizes and responds to distress in higher educational institutes, but also to make this training intersectional, so it accounts for how marginalization shapes mental health and suicide experiences. And ultimately, there should be institutional guidelines within higher education for identifying and supporting at risk students. So, for me, one of the most important realization that also shifted the way I work was understanding that suicide prevention for students, for me, for marginalized youth, or for women in particular, is not something that they can. It's not individual issue. It is not a personal issue. It is a psychosocial issue. It is an issue of institutions. So it becomes it it is also embedded in how institutions function. And that's why targeting institutions, holding them accountable, it becomes very important in this case. Because if the environment that young people are not safe or responsive, then we're just expecting students to cope within systems that will never support them. So that was my experience.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Manez. And I think, I mean, two things that have struck for me in what you've said is one is how do you build systemic accountability? And that's a policy issue, right? If you're talking about colleges and universities and training teachers across those systems, you need to be able to have policy directives which ensure that. But I think equally important, like you said, is the intersectional approach or the layering of understanding marginalized identities, and building that into how training is provided, building sensitivity, etc. So, thank you for sharing that, Manez. And I will come back to you in terms of what were your specific learnings in this whole process, in this journey, which you would like to share further. Manas, if I could come to you, and I think you've also worked on education, but in a different context in schools,
Yeah.
and something which was particularly interesting in your work was how you looked at the Right to Education Act and the structures within that, and how you built in the idea of gender-based violence and suicide prevention. So, can you talk a bit about that, please?
Yeah. Thank you, Arjun, for the intro. I think just to start with, as a counselor and as a therapist, we see a lot of cases of suicide and ideation and self-harm. And one thing which was always in my mind is how many one-on-one sessions can I take as the individual psychologist? Even there is a limit for how many sessions I can take. And while working on that, I found out about the YAS fellowship as well as I looked up कि it's not just about the individual cases that I'm dealing with. There is a pattern in which cases are coming. The pattern is basically the youth doesn't have a safe space where they can talk about their emotions or what they're going through, what their pressures are, what they're dealing with. Uh, so I think that was the main I think issue which I was able to link. Uh, so I think it's changed in my shift from individual cases to basically looking at from a more of a policy issue. Uh, and it's a governance issue due to poor implementation of existing policies. So the action that I took was recommended activation of student wellness teams in the schools. So in Akansha, they have a structure. Whenever a case comes to us, we have a certain protocol that we follow. We have a system. We know what to do in certain distress situation. In our area, there are four schools which are government schools, and they don't have any structures. जब हमारे पास cases आते हैं, they tell us कि there is one person in that school who is also dealing with the same issues, but they don't have a structure to deal with it. They don't have a school counselor. There is no school wellness team. There is no SMC members. So I think that's when I realized ki if I want to work on this, I need to start by at least in what is in my control. So these four schools are in my vicinity, and I can try and implement school wellness teams there. So I proposed it to the local Nagar Sevak, stating that these are some things which are written in the Umeed guidelines and also in the NAP that there should be a school counselor, there should be a student wellness team, and why it is not getting implemented, and how we can help you to implement it, and how we can help you to structure the whole safety team in your schools. So yeah.
Very interesting. And Manas, I think you also dealt with the school management committees, which are an interesting.
Yes.
This is a body under the Right to Education Act, which is meant to
Yes.
to govern schools. So, do you want to talk a bit about that as well?
Yeah. So I also have a word with the SMCs of our schools. We talked about what are some of the issues that they are dealing in the community. So there are a lot of suicides in the community which are happening, which is affecting the students who are coming to our school. So what we proposed was if we can give them the training of psychological first aid or at least at least of gatekeeping training, so they can identify in community if there are any people who are at the risk of suicide, and they can report it back to us, or they can give the basic emotional support at that exact moment, and then they can reach out to us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Manas. And I think that's an interesting example of how you pick an existing legislation in a different sector, such as education, and you pick up a governance structure within that, and then you integrate mental health and suicide prevention within that structure, and in terms of Moneza's approach, which is also looking at a broader systemic sort of approach to say, okay, this is a problem that exists across institutions in colleges. So how do we then kind of say mandate a certain kind and a certain quality of teacher training when it comes to mental health and suicide prevention at a systemic level? And interestingly, Moneza, I mean, maybe you can talk about it further, is you identified a very interesting program which I didn't know existed. This is, I think, the Madan Mohan Malviya training program for college teachers and faculty. That's something that was a discovery for me. So do you want to very briefly talk about that?
So I think the idea was to go through understanding teachers training program because the idea was how do we understand why the teachers is there any kind of responsibility or accountability on teachers, especially when we read mental health policies or suicide prevention policies? And one of the ways we understood was that teachers were supposed to be trained. And one of that training program, which was quite latest at that time, was Madan Mohan Malviya Teachers Training Program. I would also like to begin by saying that it was quite interesting. It was quite comprehensive in the sense that they identified the importance of training teachers to connecting it with the overall mental social well-being of students, emotional well-being of students. But what I found to be quite a huge gap was that suicide prevention was not mentioned at all, in a sense that how do you identify risk, how do you give emotional first aid, how do you offer any kind of support was actually not at all a part of it. Apart from that, even when we talk about mental health context, um, we know that mental health is a psychosocial issue. We know that mental health is multi-causal in that sense. And if we, like for instance, if I give my example, my mental health became a reason why I was my mental health became the reason why I was mostly more or less misbehaved with by some teachers, um, which is not addressed, which happens in so many layers. Um, One layer of it is definitely Muslim identities. When I talked to a lot of students from Delhi, they said that as Muslims, they felt a different kind of anxiety there. But how do you address that? And a lot of people also mention that the kind of anxiety or the kind of issues they feel because they come from a certain background, it's not addressed. So what was when I talked to different people who were from different socioeconomic background, different religious identity, the idea was that there was an expectance of what is considered to be an ideal layman in the institutes, and that ideal layman is something that we also see in these policies. And that's why intersectionality becomes important. You're not just dealing with a monolith for a student. You're dealing with someone who has a different gender identity. You're dealing with someone who comes from precarious geographies. You're dealing with someone who already has mental health issues. You're dealing with someone who's disabled. So the way they experience is is layered. And unless and until you address that, because some people uh, uh, become at risk for suicide because of the discrimination they feel because of their identity. And if that is not addressed, if that intersectionality is not addressed, you will only expect that people get suicide ideation because of their families, but you won't understand people get suicide ideation because of their caste or because of their religion. And that's why it becomes so important to introduce that there. And for me, one of the most important realization was when I was reading mental health policies as well, was also that if this was actually implemented, my experiences would have been so much better. So the problem was not just that there was these gaps that needs to be addressed, but what was already there, what was beneficial, was also something that was not addressed. And it actually made me very emotional because it meant that a lot of things that I experienced, I wouldn't have had to go through that. And that's why, and I would definitely say personally for me the most important shift that happened was that I don't tolerate that kind of behavior anymore. For me, when somebody if anyone is going to disrespect my mental health, it changes. It's not a favor teachers are doing on you. It's not a extra work. It is a right, and that changes things so much more. It is a right, and there has to be SOPs for it to be followed, and there has to be pathways for youth to demand that if it is not available. And it's not charity that we're asking for, it's just the rights. So yeah.
So powerful, Manaza. This is, I mean, it's really inspiring to, and I think what two things again which have stood out is, of course, one is that it's not charity, it's a rights-based issue. Okay, so we're talking about obligations and duties. And I think the other thing, which is a very important point, that it's not just enough to have a well-sounding or well-reading policy. You have to convert it into implementation and action. And in fact, a lot of policy work is about converting policy into action. And I'm so glad you made that point because, often there's this assumption that if we're working on policy, then we're just sitting behind laptops and drafting documents. It's not enough to have that. That's just the starting point. So, yeah, two very powerful points, Maniza. Thank you so much. I just also want to tell the audience that feel free to put in your questions and comments in there's a Q&A box over there. We will try and address the questions as we move along, or of course, we will have some time towards the end to address questions. So if you have any specific questions for Muneza and Manas, please feel free to put it in the box. And I think Muneza, there's a comment for you, so you can respond to it directly. Manas, if I can quickly come back to you, and in the next 5 minutes for both of you, can you maybe talk about, one or two aha moments that you had in your journey of doing this work, whether it was
Yeah.
the youth engagement or the community engagement, or whether it was engaging with the policymaker or the struggles of having to do that, because God, some of us who worked in that space know how challenging that can be, because that's how systems are structured, and that's nobody's fault but the system structure. Um, and yeah, and anything that, because we've got a beautiful audience here and our panelists, and so anything that you would like to share as learnings which we can take back from and integrate in the work that we are doing in different capacities.
Yeah, I think I have a lot of aha moments during this process. I think one of the aha moment was when you look at the community, you feel like they might not have that kind of a awareness of mental health, and they might not know about what is mental health, and what you should do, what is emotions. They might not know, they might not have the vocabulary, but you will be amazed by how aware they are about all these things. They just don't have a safe space, they just don't have a structured space for them to open up and talk about all these things. They have a lot to share. They have so many recommendations for the policymakers as well. I think that's why it's very important to listen to the youth. They have very creative ideas for how we can deal with suicide prevention in the community. Uh, so that is one. I think I had my biasness while talking with them, while engaging with them. But yeah, second thing is while engaging with the policymakers, I always thought that uh, if you tell them logically, this is all the things which are going on. That's why we need all these changes. They are not going to listen to you. I think we need to connect to them on a very emotional level. So the Nagar sir, which I engaged with, he was working in the same school. He was in the same school when he was a child. And as a child, I was able to connect to him when he was a child, what all things he faced during his childhood. And that's how I was able to connect to him. And that's how I was able to tell him the need to, why do we need counselors? Again, as Munasa rightly said, they all look it as the extra thing, jo उन्हें करना है. But I think it's a basic right. Mental health is a basic right. And they felt it's something extra. It's something क्योंकि they look at as an educational institute as कि if we go there, we are giving you education and that's it. They don't look it at as it's a safe space for the students or where they can come and talk about all these things. They feel this is something which is done outside the school. So I think changing that mental shift for them was something which was very important. And yeah, when you're able to connect to them on the emotional level, they really listen to you. So I think that is one aha moment for me. Another thing is, while talking with the community as well, while talking with the SMC members, they had so many suggestions about how we can deal with certain issues which are going on in the community. They just need someone to listen to them and support them through all these things. So yeah, they have a lot of ideas. They just need a space to tell them. Yeah.
Fabulous. And I love that point about connecting on emotions because policy is again seen as such a technocratic, rational, logical, heavy thing.
Yeah.
But often, you know, it's so important to realize that emotion must drive some of these things. And one of the ways to push this is to be able to connect at an emotional, affective level. And I think that's where lived experience engagement becomes so very important to share stories, to share those stories from the community, because something somewhere is bound to connect with the policymaker or the person on the other end. Muneza, if I could come to you for your aha moments. Yeah.
Um, I think for me, some aha moments was definitely, as I mentioned, that um, uh, the fact that it is very empowering to know your rights. It's extremely empowering to not just to go to a policymaker and tell us or demand policymaker to, hey, this is something that needs to be implemented. But in general, when you are living your life or you're in an educational institute, it really empowers you in that sense. It really helps you. I think for me, the I the most I wouldn't say it was aha as much it was oh why why wasn't this in place? Why are students made to feel the way they are when they are not supposed to? And for me, I would also say that what I realized in policymaking itself is, and I think somewhere Manas also mentioned that people are willing to work, people are willing to take the extra step, especially youth. They have ideas, they have the lived experience, they have the need assessments done, and I feel like it's very important when we talk about participation in that sense. Engaging with policymakers does not means participation, but participation does not automatically translate into influence. So sometimes I also kept on thinking whether there are those restrictions on actually creating influence, actually holding more influential power. And I think um, and how it's again another moment was that it's not gonna be same for you. It is such a diverse experience, in the sense that if you get a good policymaker, you will get a really your process will become very easy. But if it ultimately is something that is inherently slow, it is something that requires a lot of patience, and it requires a lot of back and forth. And if you are someone with structural challenges, if you are someone, like for me, I am someone who's navigating disabilities, then we also need to think, while we are working in advocacy, that there are limits to your energy and capacity. So there has to be that extra support for people uh, to sustain this kind of work, to not just introduce it, to not just uh, make aware of, but also understanding how do you make this policy advocacy process more inclusive for people with different capacity and with different needs as well. So yeah, I would say that my aha moment definitely was that I personally felt very empowered, and I personally, in my personal life with teachers, I would say it helped me, you know, not take whatever they give me to stand up. But I do think there were some moments also that we need to think of.
And rightfully said, I think the oh moments are as important because they also it's important for us to also engage with the failures of the system and the frustrations of the system, because that is policy work at the end of the day, and it is part of the process. And I think the other point that you made, Munazza, about there being diverse experiences and that different policymakers or systems or institutions will, you might have different experiences. And I think a lot of policy work is being able to navigate and strategize for those spaces, because we can't change that. That is the nature of the system. But how do we work with that? I think that's very critical, and I think that's something that young people or youth leaders will definitely benefit from. Um, it's been beautiful speaking to both of you. Thank you so much, Maneza Manas, for sharing such compelling insights. I'm not letting you go because you have to come back for the Q&A towards the end. And again, I would urge the audience to please put in your comments and questions as and when you would like to. But I'd like to take this opportunity to now transition to the next segment of this event, which is our panel discussion. And it is my honor to really introduce a very, very exciting panel. If I could first begin with Rohini Pradhan ma'am. Rohini ma'am is a Special Secretary cum Program Director of Sikkim Inspires and the Planning and Development Department of the Government of Sikkim. Rohini ma'am has a whole list of yeah, achievements in terms of the incredible work she's done, but I'm just going to pick a couple which I felt were really important. And so one is, of course, Rohini ma'am has been leading the Sikkim Inspires program, which stands for the Integrated Service Provision and Innovation for Reviving Economies program for Sikkim. It is the first direct partnership program of the state government with the World Bank in the social sector. Um, while Sikkim Inspires is an economic inclusion program, the incredible aspect of this program is that it actually integrates mental health. Because at Inspires, the program believes that mental well-being of a citizen is vital to that person becoming a good economic citizen. Apart from that, Rohini ma'am has also done some incredible work in the space of disabilities. So she led the creation of a state fund for disabilities under the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, which also applies to people with mental health problems and conditions. Apart from that, she also conceived the first state action plan for drug demand reduction. And very interestingly, the first state level children's parliament, where young children parliamentarians from the districts were chosen to discuss on important topics such as drug abuse, and their point of view on the entire prevention, control, and punishment components. And in fact, the child parliamentarians passed recommendations for improving government intervention, which was submitted to the Minister for Education and the Education Department, and is an example of how children have been placed at the center of policy thinking in Sikkim. Another very interesting thing that I must emphasize is that Rohini ma'am, under the Sikkim Inspires program, has also led the drafting of the Sikkim Integrated Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Strategy. It's an incredible document. Please have a look at it. A very progressive approach to mental health and suicide prevention, one of the very few instances, both in our country and across the world. So it's a pleasure and an honor to have you here, Rohini ma'am. If I can now introduce Professor Srividya Iyer, who is the Canada Research Chair in Youth Mental Health and Learning Health Systems and a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University in Montreal. She also works as a psychologist in a publicly funded service for young people in Montreal. Her research focuses on understanding young people's lives and partnering with youth and communities to design and implement, evaluate, and advocate for youth-attuned and culturally relevant mental health services and policies. Her work takes place in Canada and globally, including in India, but she's also had a specific focus on traditionally underserved and indigenous communities, and I can say she's done some really path-breaking work that we all can learn from in India and across the world over here. Pleasure to have you here, Vidya. If I can now introduce the next panelist, Shraddha Chikurur, who holds a PhD in gender studies. Shraddha has taught at the University of Hyderabad and worked with several NGOs across India for a decade on gender and development issues. Since 2022, she has worked with the United Nations, with multiple UN agencies, and is currently part of UNESCO's Social and Human Sciences sector, and more recently has led a convening on youth mental health and climate change, which is, again, a very important area. She has also co-edited a book on honor and women's rights in South Asia. Outside of work, she enjoys exploring books and traveling with her 9-year-old. Next, we have Hannah Stewart. And again, I'm really, really pleased to introduce Hannah. Um, Hannah is a doctoral candidate at the UT Health Houston School of Public Health and the Chief Research and Knowledge Officer at Generation Mental Health, a path-breaking youth-led global mental health organization. Hannah's work spans across research, practice, advocacy in global mental health, with a focus on anti-colonial and community-based approaches to global health. She has helped create Generation Mental Health's Possibilities Collective, a new project which has been commissioned by Wellcome Trust, which is aiming to build an ecosystem that positions young people and people with psychosocial disabilities as leaders in global mental health research. And Hannah's also been open about her own lived experience of disability and works in solidarity with communities addressing structural violence. If some of you are interested in research, then please do get in touch with Hannah and the Possibilities Collective. Okay, so let's begin this panel discussion. If I can first begin with you, Vidya. And if you can talk a bit about from your own research in terms of what examples can demonstrate or how does research demonstrate the links between structural determinants or social determinants, youth suicides, and policy governance? If you could sort of briefly sort of help us establish that link in terms of the research that you've done.
Thank you, Arjun, for the question and for inviting me for this panel. I think it's going to be a hard thing to follow. Manas and Manaza, they were full of like power and impact. So I'm going to try, especially to talk about, I think in terms of evidence, there's consistent evidence that many social and structural determinants like economic precarity, unemployment, early childhood adversity, these are clearly linked to a higher risk for suicide. That's sort of the first thing. The second and really important thing is that these don't operate in isolation, they often operate in clusters. So this is very important. And if you take, for example, the context in India, if you're looking at suicides among young people, we often talk about exam stress, and which is an important factor. So, but there's the exam stress, and then there might be additional factors, for instance, discrimination or lack of belonging for students from lower caste backgrounds. There might be, in addition, gender norms that might restrict autonomy. So, really, like the combination of things. So, there's also evidence that this intersecting or combination of determinants is particularly problematic. The third, I think, is that often we tend to still think about social determinants at an individual level. So we still think it's this person's gender, this person's, but actually it's really thinking about these as structures and systems that then shape your everyday lives and then increase your risk for suicide. So even for instance, if you say isolation, it's easy to say, oh, young people are online all the time or they're on social media all the time. But there's many factors that shape that rapid urbanization, a sense of disconnection, a sense of uncertainty about the future, migration from urban to rural, like increased emphasis on like competition, market economy. So it's still, even when we think about social factors, we tend to think about it at an individual level, and we really do need to think about it at a systems or policy level. In my own work, I've had like sort of the privilege of working with many indigenous communities in Canada, and from whom I've learned a tremendous lot. And really, the example of structural comes very clear in this case. So, for those of you who don't know, indigenous peoples are the original inhabitants of Canada, and they lived in these lands for many, many years before colonization happened, and they still hold like rich diversity, cultures, knowledge systems, and there was tremendous harm done during colonization, like land dispossession. We had residential schools all the way up to 1996. There's continuing policies that have really been policies that have systematically dispossessed peoples of rights. But these are also the same communities that are doing some of the most path-breaking work in terms of thinking about solutions to mental health and suicide. And the reason this is important is that in many indigenous communities, like including particularly among the Inuit, but other First Nations and Métis, those are the three big groups. Um, Among young people, particularly, the rates of suicide are among the highest in the world. So if you look at Canada's rates, you won't see this. But if you look at particularly the rates in Indigenous communities, they are among the highest in the world. And this is clearly linked to some of the policies that I mentioned, residential schools, trauma, ongoing sort of land dispossession. In many communities, we still don't have safe drinking water in all Indigenous communities in Canada. This is the context, but these are also the same communities that are leading the way in thinking about how to address these. Like community-led interventions, and youth have actually been at the forefront of some of these things. For instance, land and land rights and self-governance and self-determination as being key to mental health. Really thinking about connection to culture, to connection to land, self-governance, data data sovereignty, as these as being fundamental elements and fundamental building blocks of mental health and well-being and suicide responses, which I think is really very, very striking. And there was research done in Canada that has clearly shown that in those communities where there is a little bit more, there's more self-determination in terms of governance, many more people speak the language, many more people feel connected to their culture. So the sense of cultural continuity, it clearly is linked to rates of suicide. So in terms of evidence, there could be nothing more powerful and impactful than showing that. And on the flip side, what that means is that a response to this should involve language revitalization, a connection to the land, enhanced sense of collective self-determination. So you cannot have a response that is about individual factors that we often have, not that there is still value in some of those downstream responses, helplines or risk detection or therapy, but it has to have these components have to be part of the suicide prevention response. I'm going to stop here so that happy to keep talking, and I'm curious to hear the others as well.
No, thank you, Vidya. That's fascinating, and I think you've kind of really laid out that landscape, the breadth of that landscape, and I think we can spend hours unpacking each of these and then drawing out what links this has with policy and governance. And I think in Canada's context, the example of residential schools is a very clear example of how a policy measure has actually exacerbated conditions. But at the same time, there is research to say that language revitalization, like you've said, has actually shown reduction in suicide rates amongst youth from indigenous communities. Um, Roni, ma'am, if I can come to you building on that now, because in the context of Sikkim specifically, I think it'll be very interesting because Sikkim is also a very unique state in India for various reasons, and I'll allow you to sort of frame that in terms of how you think would be the most meaningful. But I think you particularly, as a policymaker, have been very clear about the fact that mental health and suicide prevention falls within a developmental discourse. And you have also demonstrated that through the Sikkim Inspires program. So can you kind of just contextualize this a little bit for us in the context of Sikkim's youth and how you've seen mental health and suicide prevention as a development policy issue? Rather, why have you seen it as a development and policy issue?
Thank you, Arjun. Yeah, so in Sikkim, youth suicide is we see it as a profound, development and governance challenge because it is inextricably linked to the state's rapid socioeconomic transition. So, on one hand, you see that Sikkim is one of the India's fastest growing states with very high per capita income and significant poverty reduction, but it still remains a society in transition, and it faces its unique hurdles. So, this issue, we've seen it as a development paradox, if I can put it like that, So the developmental issues like very high unemployment, especially coupled with mismatch in the women and youth's aspiration and the reality mismatch when they go onto the job market, and particularly for young adults aged between 18 to 25, and over reliance on government jobs create significant distress here. And furthermore, environmental factors like climate change, if I can say, and frequent natural disasters also add layers of sort of unpredictability and confinement that impact mental health of young people. And it's also a governance and systemic gap. I would say that suicide prevention is a governance issue because it requires a coordinated intersectoral strategy rather than isolated efforts.
Yeah.
So currently, several government departments work in silos, leading to implementation challenges and a lack of sustainable long-term programs. So there is a critical gap in suicide surveillance and data collection also, which can lead to an inaccurate, understanding of the state's actual suicide rates and hinder effective policy responses also. And we also see it as a public health crisis because since 2008, Sikkim has reported the highest suicide rate in India.
Yeah.
In 2022, the state's rate was 43.1 per 1 lakh population, more than triple the national average. So, highlighting an urgent need for governance that prioritizes mental health as a fundamental right and a central pillar of public health was something which was very important for us. And yeah, all these challenges coupled with the other sort of public health challenge that the state is facing right now, which is the declining rate of population. Our TFR is the lowest in the country, it's 1.1. So all this put together makes the youth suicide in youth, not just suicide but overall mental health and well-being of youth, a very very a big priority area for the government of Sikkim.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, ma'am. And I think you've again provided that context specific landscape. And I think both from what Vidya has shared and what you've shared, I think we have to begin with context and understanding where we are situated, what is the socio political economy of the space, before we start to think about what kind of solutions around mental health and suicide prevention can work. And I think that's both a question of, like you said, intersectorality, which is getting governments, departments together, not working in silos. But I think it's
Very
also a question of interdisciplinarity. We need, policy work is also being able to draw upon evidence and learnings from other disciplines and community spaces, and have that dialogue with policymakers. And I think Sikkim is also an incredible example of some of that kind of work which is happening. Shraddha, if I could come to you, building on both of this, and I think because you work at UNESCO, which is a global, in many ways, a policy making body as well, spanning across science, education, culture, and you've also touched upon recently some work around climate change, mental health in young people. So can you talk a bit about how you are seeing this sort of intersection of policy and issues which are impacting youth in the context of the work that you've been doing?
Thank you, Arjun. Thank you. And I would like to echo Vidya to say that after Munaza and Manas, it's great to sort of, it was a great start to the conversation. So inspired by what Rohini ma'am is also doing within her space, and just what you read out was very interesting. The UN now is a intergovernmental body, right? So what we do is actually pull all the member states together and get them to, and I'm just very very simply putting out how it operates, right? Also to figure out what are the pain points of interventions, is that you have member states coming in together and then agreeing that something is an issue. So that's one very important step that as young people we could have, where you bring it to global attention that this is an issue. And thankfully youth participation has, thanks to a lot of halla that the youth have been able to make over the years, over generations, the amount of attention and spaces that young people have created for themselves within the space of the UN is incredible. And but of course, every issue requires sort of this intersectional youth approach. And mental health has also been an important issue. But having said that, there isn't an overarching framework or policy document or convention that speaks to specifically suicide, but mental health, of course, within, and the usual suspects of UNICEF and WHO, and these agencies have a lot of documents and research around this. But suicide doesn't figure as an important issue that needs to be addressed so far, based on what I know about it. And it's actually great that we're sort of bringing attention to that. So within the UN spaces, then you agree upon something, and then there are levels and levels at which you can percolate that conversation, right? Including, for example, where the space that I work in, which is with individual member states within South Asia, to then make that happen. So, for example, the piece of work that we did with Center for Youth, with you all, is to think about. So the brief that we were given from UNESCO headquarters is to think about youth and mental health. And we said, okay, great, that's like a really big topic. We want to think about how we can put climate together with that. And then it was really interesting to see things like eco-anxiety coming up, for example, and thinking about how young people are living with these ideas of this doom about the future, with all the talk that happens around them. And what does the next 5 year, 10 year, 15 year look like, and that burden of living with that, and then what that does in terms of mental health and the chipping away of your sort of well-being, right? And then, of course, there's such interesting insights that came out of that work, where you talk about a loss of intergenerational spaces. So, I mean, within UNESCO's thing also, you're talking about educational spaces, and of course, Munaza touched upon it in a big way, and so did Manas. How does programming then work, where you're talking about the kind of amazing work that people like Manas and Munaza can do, and then for scale, how you can influence programs where UNESCO, for example, works on the school health and wellness program under the RKSK, the Rashtriya Kishore and Swasthya Karikram, which is one of our biggest sort of, again, great on paper, but then, UNESCO in its small way tries to influence at least a bunch of teachers, and then, curricular integration. And there, when you have youth participating, shaping agendas, asking for what they need, speaking up about gaps, these are amazing ways of then working with civil society organization, working with networks, working with people like UNESCO to sort of say that this is what we need. And then, I mean, there are all these tools of policies, of creating like look-at alerts, and all of these for us to sort of bring it all together. So there are so many ways in which there are intersections with policies and programs. Again, with all the issues that people have already flagged in terms of getting people to listen, emotional appeals, and hard facts and research, which again is something that the UN generally and UNESCO also invests in. So, yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. And so 2 points that I would like to come back to you, Shraddha. One is, this interesting point about how you talked about how the UNESCO headquarters wanted to do something about youth mental health. And you said, okay, this is really broad. We need to kind of specify, and then you chose climate. I'd be interested to know, because a lot of young people here and youth leaders here, is how do they come up to you or UNESCO and shape that agenda? Okay, I think that would be very interesting. And I think the second part of your question, which is also about some of these strategies say, around lok adalats or different ways of engaging, how do young people get involved? Because otherwise these bodies sound really intimidating, inaccessible, but very important, even though
Yes.
whatever the geopolitical climate is today, I don't want to get into that, but they're important spaces for us to be able to push discourse. So I will come back to you on that in the second round. But for now, I want to come back to come to Hannah. Hannah, I think generational mental health is a really interesting space because of the fact that it is a global mental health organization which works with youth, is led by youth with lived experience. And I think this whole conversation today is really ultimately about engaging youth lived experience in policy discussions and spaces. So can you talk a bit about GenMH's work, your experiences of how you've seen this intersection of youth lived experience, mental health, suicide prevention, and policy from the standpoint of a youth-led organization? Because I think there are youth leaders here who might want to set up their own spaces tomorrow?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by saying, as a caveat, I have aged out technically of the definition of young person, but most of everyone else at Generation Mental Health is a young person. I think at 33, I am the oldest person on our leadership team. And I think the stories that you've heard today are a really great example of what happens when young people, and particularly young people with lived experience, are not engaged in policies. So I think Maneza called them uh-oh moments. And I think we have far too many uh-oh moments. We get to uh-oh moments because the policies that are created, the systems that are created around us don't reflect our experiences, don't reflect us, particularly if we're bringing in intersectional identities like caste oppression, ethnic or religious oppression, gender oppression, disability oppression. Even more, those policies and those systems are not going to reflect our realities and our abilities to engage with them. So for Generation Mental Health, we really think about mental health as being something that's driven by systems and therefore requires systems change. You know, I was struck by what I heard when I think Manas was talking about how, as one psychologist, how many individual appointments can he take? And I think that's really poignant and the perfect example for why it is that we work so hard to work upstream at the systems level and at the policy level. So, Generation Mental Health does this through a variety of mechanisms. We focus really on policy, research, and advocacy. And all of these things are intertwined, right? What is centered in the research agenda drives evidence based policy. So, if we have gaps in the evidence base, then we'll have gaps in evidence based policy. A lot of what makes it onto the policy agenda is driven by advocacy, and whose advocacy is heard, who gets an opportunity to engage in advocacy, is also driven by systems. And so at Generation Mental Health, we've created resources that we hope give young people the tools to engage with new skills, skills like generating their own research or participating in research alongside like-minded academic allies, and engaging in policy spaces and advocacy spaces so that they can drive the changes that they think are most important to them. I am one person and I have a really unique lived experience in the sense that I am a white woman who's highly educated. I'm living in the South in the United States. And that's a very different policy context than someone who is going to be doing policy advocacy in India. And so we really think about what does it mean to drive systems change, but then how can we empower people to take those tools and hyper localize or contextualize them so that they are driving culturally relevant, lived experience centered solutions that are going to work for them. I think if Generation Mental Health were trying to drive policy change by giving everyone the same set of tools, then we would sort of be replicating the colonial and neo-colonial processes that I think have gotten us very much in this situation. And so we really do believe that if we give young people the tools, they're going to be able to dismantle the systems that are keeping young people and people with lived experience sort of in these oppressed states. So yeah, that's the approach that we take. I think we have heard from people around the world that policy advocacy and engaging with policy looks very different. In the US, we talk a lot about what it means to engage in nonviolent and peaceful protests. That's a cornerstone of sort of the US cultural movement around policy advocacy, very effective in the civil rights movement, maybe less effective now, but that's a different story for a different day. But what we heard when we were talking to policy advocates in, let's say, West Africa, for example, they were saying like nonviolent protests are not a tool that we can rely on in our toolkit because there's not an opportunity to protest nonviolently. If we show up in protest, there is a high likelihood that the policy makers and the government systems that we're protesting will respond violently regardless of our behavior. And so we've had to empower advocates in different contexts to think about what are going to be the policy tools and the advocacy tools that are going to be most effective in anyone's particular situation or context, and really contextualize that in a way that is going to be the most effective for them.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much, Hannah. And I think again, one point that strikes for me is that, I mean, there are some universal principles, and then there are principles which are specific to context. And I think it's important to understand that young people across the world are not a monolith or a homogeneous group. They're very diverse, coming from very different contexts and functioning in very different contexts. But I think there's a lot to even learn. So, for instance, what's happening in Canada vis-a-vis Sikkim, vis-a-vis your work with generation mental health's work, and the things that Shraddha's doing with UNESCO and working across a cross section of young people. I think it's important for us to be able to think of what are those tools, what's worked in what kinds of contexts, and be able to sort of formulate those based on each other's learnings. I think that is extremely critical. Before moving to the second round, and I know we have about 15 minutes for the second round, I want to quickly read some comments that have come in. So there's one comment which says that seeing not only youth and teens, but adults also attempting suicide is alarming. I feel parents should be taught signs of mental health issue recognition in schools compulsorily. So, very interesting point about educating parents within the school systems along with their children. There's a question on majority of married women in India struggle with mental health issues because of in-laws in their marital homes. Nobody does anything about it, and so many women die because of it. How can that be addressed? Is this a question one of you would like to take at this stage? Maybe Shraddha, because you've also worked on gender specifically.
Well, we just have to fix patriarchy. Very simple answer. No, I'm kidding. But I mean, this is definitely something that is very much part of gender-based violence interventions that are done through various feminist organizations. Even one of the organizations listed in our chat, Sneha, does a lot of work around that in Mumbai, but otherwise as well. So this is definitely a huge and important piece of work. But you see, if offering mental health intervention is a band-aid, there are structural issues that need to be sorted, which will require more than just another conversation. It's like a huge power imbalance in the way our relationships, marriages, institutions, law, everything is structured. And so there's a lot of pushing that we all have to do to be able to fix that.
Okay, thanks, Shraddha. There's another comment. In schools, self-harm and suicide cases are usually brushed by informing the parents. However, counselors are not given the time and space to work with these children. Again, an example of a systemic issue. There's a comment about how there's a range of factors from intergenerational trauma, birth trauma, domestic violence, interpersonal violence, access to resources, etc., which impact the lives of those who may die by suicide. And so it is important to understand these indicators also, and not simply look at data on death by suicides without looking at these correlating indicators. I think that's an incredible point for research as well. Okay, I'm going to come back to the second round, and we've got about 15 minutes. So I'll come back to you with that. I think this is a point that Hannah was making around how policy, research, and advocacy are not, they're all intertwined. And Manas also made the interesting point about how sometimes just talking about data or logic or evidence to policymakers doesn't always yield results. Sometimes it's important to connect emotionally as well. But I think it is important to foreground research, because I think the whole idea that policies should be evidence-based, evidence-driven. But the challenge really has been, how do we, because there's this idea that research and policy are in silos, and it can be contested, but there's also maybe an element of truth there. So how do we bridge that? And especially for young people, how do you think we can create infrastructures and ecosystems for young people to be able to convert research evidence into policy insights and then take them to their policymakers and communicate it to their policymakers?
So maybe just I'm going to answer this in a couple of different ways, because there's already been some really interesting ideas and responses to this question. One, I think, particularly given the conversation that we are having about suicide and suicide among young people, suicide that's uh, higher among married women. I think if we are clear also on some of the key messages from research that are important to relay, that would be helpful. Like one, that suicide is structurally patterned, which means that you cannot have only responses that are uh, crisis lines, clinical services, risk detection, all of which is important, but it can't be only that because it is structurally patterned. So, and then what does that mean in terms of responses? If we can have some sort of idea of like what are some things that are backed by evidence. So, for example, in the Indian context, like education reform, we do need some of those attitude changes that Shraddha said, but we could start with like a rights-based and anti-discrimination framework, like discrimination on the basis of caste, gender, religion, like really strong laws and making sure that everyone is aware of that. Economic protection and things like cash transfers and guaranteed income, where we know there is clear evidence that these work for mental health, well-being, suicide prevention, and then maybe increasingly safe digital ecosystem. So if we have some clear ways to take evidence, and so if we say it's structurally patterned, it's social determinants, sometimes it's hard for people to know what does that actually mean in terms of policy responses. I think it would help to have some clarity on what it could mean in terms of policy responses. And of course, these have to be then context sensitive and culturally relevant. In For your other part of the question, I think one important thing is it isn't only a question of um, there are techniques, and I could say make it lay language, use digital narratives, and all of those are important. And I will get to some of those sorts of things. But I think it's not just that, it's not just a question of taking evidence and simplifying evidence, or that we've failed to communicate evidence. Part of the question is whose voice counts in shaping policy. So it's not just about doing work on equipping young people to relay evidence more powerfully. It's really about shifting the conversation and helping young people shift the conversation about whose voice counts and so it's about like who's seen as credible, whose knowledge is prioritized. So we shouldn't only be thinking about what kind of strategies work to relay evidence to shift policy, what kind of strategies work to shift whose voice counts. It's a slightly different conversation because I think one is easier. Like we can think about, use social media, mix numbers and narratives, all of which is important. And I'm not at all dissing any of these. Like they're all super important. But I think sometimes we stay in that space, and that space can only take you this far because it's not only about a lack of communication strategies or a lack of like, how to package this well. Like, and those are problematic, but that's not where the problem is. It's about like it shouldn't be people like me only, like like from people like McGill or Nimhans. Like if you're talking about mental health conversations, where are the young people, where are the ASHA workers who see people in the community? How does their voice shift policy? So we really do need to shift the conversation from strategies, because I think we've had a lot of interesting work now on like what kind of strategies work. And there are some things we know that if you use, evocative language, if you really embed research, if you create evidence that is really responding to questions that policymakers have, if you combine head and heart, so you have numbers and narratives, you like the stories we heard today of like really like youth leading some of this are also excellent examples. I also think from my own experience, relationships and long-term relationships really seem to help, because while the top political brass might keep changing, there are many people who work at multiple other levels who are much more stable in government. So creating and cultivating a long-term relationship matters. Embedding research in real world settings, in real world systems matters. I also think to some extent, if researchers want to change or want to really evidence, or if anybody wants evidence to be translated into practice and policy, it also at times involves two things. One, being a bit more politically engaged. I think we were not trained that way, or we don't choose to do that. And I think at times you can't say evidence and then do nothing to really say how that evidence should be reflected. And sometimes it does require you to be a bit more politically engaged. And then the last thing, one thing I've noticed in Canada certainly is that there are critical timing, and sometimes it's unfortunate incidents but you do need to be mindful of those critical times. So, sometimes there are like, unfortunately, like clusters of suicide, or there might be one suicide in a young person in a group home. Then you can really talk about child welfare services. These have resulted in some policy shifts. It does require you to be attuned to the timing and how it could help, but also not then sort of romanticize or cash in on a tragedy. But there are windows of opportunity, I think, that might be really more useful or less useful for shifting the conversation on policy. I hope that kind of gives a little bit of like, yeah, I know it's
Absolutely.
probably
There's
not
a
what you
lot
were
back.
thinking of in terms of here's the knowledge translation guidebook, because I
No.
feel like that you can find online. Like it's not.
No, but I think that the critical point around which you're making is knowledge translation is also about whose knowledge and what gets
Yes.
counted as knowledge. And in a world where certain systems of knowledge are oppressed, what do we need to do in order to
Yes.
give them the space that they deserve? And I think that is really fundamentally one at the heart of what we're trying to achieve over here. And I also think it's you've also given us a theme for the next YASP Fellowship Dialogue, because I think it is important for us to really focus and think about this question. So thank you for that, Vidya. Rohini ma'am, if I could come to you, I and my colleagues have had the privilege of working with you because, and I can say it's been one of the most remarkable experiences of engaging with a policymaker. And I don't mean to flatter you, but genuinely to understand that there are good examples out there. Um, but at the same time, we also know that that's not the reality across the country. So I think one question that I think a lot of young people have asked us when we would kind of when we were doing the training and sessions during the YAS fellowship was, okay, how do you go and engage with the policymaker? And it's helpful to sometimes know as a policymaker, what are you looking for when somebody comes to you in your office? What is it that can actually get you, what gets your attention? Or, you know, how does young people navigate this really complex space of entering a government building and walking through those corridors and then sitting outside, a door for many hours, though we've not had to do that with you, but that's the reality. So any insights on how this can be navigated, because it is an oho moment, to use Moneza's term. It is an oho moment for a lot of us working in this space.
I know, I mean, it is sad, but I have to say that it is a reality for a lot of governments that the young people, they don't feel safe to come to us with their problems. And sometimes, like I think Munaza was talking about her experience and how uh, mm, we fail to identify those systemic gaps, right, in the implementation of the policy. But I have to say that sometimes these gaps are simply invisible to us policymakers. Right. And then the language that these youth are talking and the language in which we are so used to conversant when we talk about a policy, like we would be talking two different languages. So it's very, sometimes we also find it very difficult to come to a common platform where we can engage with the youth in a very meaningful manner. But then having said that, as a policymaker, I think it makes a hell lot of difference when you can actually engage with your youth in a meaningful manner, for the especially for the topics that is actually affecting them the most. Like for example, when governments draft policies around mental health, suicide prevention, I think young people, youth are the demography that is the most affected by these policies. And I think by not talking to this cohort of people while making policies which is actually meant for them and which actually affects their life, I think it's a huge mismatch. So yeah, I don't think there would be a single formula that I can prescribe for the young people to come and talk to or have a meaningful dialogue with policymakers. But I would just like to urge our young people who are connected with us today, or who would see this conversation um, after through the recordings. It is very important for you to speak up, because many a times, like, we don't even know that this problem exists, and until and unless we do not know if a problem is there, then I don't know how we will even start addressing that problem in a meaningful manner. So yeah, this conversation, dialogue, having a dialogue is very important, and it is very important for any policy, for that matter, not just for mental health or for suicide prevention. For any policy not to be top down, it has to be bottoms up, for it to be a meaningful you know policy that can actually be translated into actions, and which will be which it ensures a sustainable implementation, I would say. When the policies are owned by people for whom it is meant, I think it helps the government also to implement it on the ground. So yeah, having this conversation between the policymakers and the people for whom these policies are made is of, I mean, a top should be a top priority for everyone.
Yeah. Thank you for that, ma'am, and point well taken. I think it is a complex terrain to navigate, but I think we need to think of structures and systems where
Yes.
this engagement and interaction is happening in a wide variety of ways. And I think Vidya was also talking about how one process can't always work, and also to foreground, whose voice and who's coming forth and putting that point across to policymakers. I think that's really critical. We have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to come to Hannah and then to Shraddha very quickly. Hannah, like I mentioned before, there are young people here who might want to go ahead and set up their own organizations and initiatives. Can you share some really practical insights around, what can be helpful for young people to be able to actually build leadership in this space, specifically when it comes to policy engagement? Because GenMH is an example of that. But can you talk to a little bit about what practical takeaways can young people take away from this conversation? Yeah, if they're looking at building leadership in the mental health suicide prevention space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's no one size fits all solution. I think one of the things that I think is incredibly true is that the political landscape and the world around us is changing constantly. And young people are often on the forefront of that change and really pushing innovation ahead in a way that is incredible to watch. And as a result, I think young people are some of the best suited to really drive policy change because they're really living in the world in a different way. Their access to technology, their fluency with technology, their style of communication is effective in a way that it's not always true for other populations. And so I think if I were talking to myself maybe 10 years ago, I would want young leaders like the Hannah of that decade and now to know that if you see a need in your community, you do not need to put together a formal nonprofit to start filling that gap. Find people who believe in the things that you believe in, make friends with them, whether they're digital friends from half a world away or in your own community, and organize and build community with one another. Generation Mental Health started because several incredible mental health leaders, including some in this room, got together while they were in India, came up with an idea to change global mental health, and here we are several years later with giant research contracts from the Wellcome Trust, which is just a real dream come true for all of us. But you don't have to wait until you have that nonprofit status to start making a difference.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Hannah. And maybe at some point you can drop an email ID for young people to reach out to you at some point, to have some sort of interaction, learning exchange. I think that will be helpful as well for young people in India to learn from that experience. Shraddha, if I could come back to you with the question that I'd posed earlier, which is really to look at what is the gateway for, say, young people in India or the global South or low middle income countries to be able to have their voice heard. on global platforms such as UNESCO. And this is again tying to the point that Vidya was making. What are the ways in which, what are pathways that we can create for that to happen, and really restore the balance, the huge imbalance in the broader global context?
So the, actually, the answers are given by speakers before me. What Hannah was talking about, what Vidya was talking about, policy making at the UN does not start globally. You have to make a noise where you are. You have to start doing something with a problem that you identify. How people have very eloquently, starting with Munaza and Manas, shown us. But it is people who've ruffled feathers at the local level, within their communities, within their institutions, who actually then trickle into get noticed and trickle up, so to say. So even if you just take Munaza's example, she was doing something, applied for UN women sort of cohort, which was youth feminist leadership. It was a co-created program, extremely chaotic, but a very very interesting process which really shook up anybody. And I was only briefly associated with it, but an extremely interesting process that UN Women was able to put together with funding and so on. But also the work that we did, right? We picked up young leaders from 6 South Asian countries, and then the global forums, I mean, young people who speak in global forums are people who have had experience of doing something, who've raised their voices, who've put together like-minded people, and tried to create ripples. And so, for example, people who were part of our South Asia consultation on youth, mental health, and climate have been able to. The people in Bhutan have been able to actually participate in the UNESCO Youth Conference, which happened in the in Kazakhstan, because she was doing something. This is somebody who actually spoke about eco anxiety and climate, and is a youth activist in Bhutan. So. So you have to be able to do something with the problems that you identify at the local level. And that's how you'll eventually, through local networks, through NGOs, through open calls, because increasing, like I said, the UN and generally the government is recognizing that we need you to be part of policy making, right? We need you to hear them. And of course, then, along with development partners, civil society partners, the UN tries to bridge the gap that Rohini ma'am was talking about, where you feel like you're speaking different languages, and we'll try to sort of give you platforms where you can connect and ensure that the groups understand each other and find the vocabulary to talk to each other. Yeah. I'll stop here in terms of time.
Thank you so much, Shraddha. And I'm afraid we're at time. We're 2 minutes beyond 8, but it's been an absolutely riveting conversation. And I hope one in a series of conversations that we will continue to have, because I think this in itself has brought up so much. But my wish is that we're able to build some collaborations, at least with the folks over here. There's Manas, Muneza, and the whole other range of YAS fellows who've done some incredible work, and they've, of course, they're not here, but also in terms of the work, that Vidya, you've been doing in terms of research and learnings from Canada. I think, Shraddha, you've already talked about the opportunities within spaces like UNESCO, and maybe it would be great to see how we can create some of those opportunities, and of course to link it with the work that's happening in Sikkim, and also create pathways for young people over there to get involved in some of this work and then come back and work with the government there, and think of solutions and ideas where we can really embed suicide prevention in the community space. And of course, Hannah has left, but I think having that conversation at a global space, and kind of drawing from those learnings as well, and looking at how we can have cross-country, cross-cultural sort of collaborations, learning exchanges, will be really, really great. So my wish is that our conversation doesn't end here, but that it does lead to pursuing new opportunities. And of course, we will center the youth leaders and the YAS fellows, and hopefully other fellowship programs where other youth leaders are focusing on similar work. I apologize to the audience that we can't address any more questions because we're beyond time, but we have shared our email ID in the chat box. So please do write to us. And if you have questions or you wish to be connected to any of the speakers here. I hope I have the approval of the speakers to do that. And to stay in touch. And we will, of course, come back sometime soon with another dialogue on an important issue. But I'd really like to thank Vidya, Rohini ma'am, Shraddha, Hannah, and last but not the least, Muneza and Manas for being so powerful and incredible in the stories and the experiences you've shared. And I'd also like to thank our team at the Center for Mental Health Law and Policy, Wayne, Shruti, Sonali, Gauri, Kavita, who have worked very hard to put together this event. So thank you very much. Have a great evening, and please stay in touch and take care of yourselves. Bye bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.